To understand why this is a bad thing, we have to confront a hard truth that few people seem to want to face about the Souls games, including FromSoft themselves, but here it is. The combat is nothing remarkable. In terms of actual complexity, there's not much going on. There's not much depth, and that wouldn't be a problem, except that the series has increasingly leaned on its action elements more and more as time has gone by. Bloodborne is the clearest example of this so far. Unfortunately, even with the addition of trick weapons, there's still a case to be made that overall the combat doesn't even have depth exceeding basic action games. If anything, Bloodborne actually has less depth than any other game in the series. Dodging telegraphed attacks, which come out in predefined combos, is just exploiting your knowledge that the AI is acting within the constraints of a computer game. To be clear, there's absolutely nothing wrong with simple combat mechanics, but if the game is going to be so relentlessly focused on action, then I have fewer reasons not to just play a better action game instead. So prepare to roll, again and again, and again and again and again.
So prepare to roll, again and again, and again and again and again. And again and again and again. All that's left for me in terms of engagement is the combat. And that combat, it bears reiterating, is pretty unremarkable. It's incredibly simple, with very little wiggle room for skill expression, unlike many other heavily combat-focused games it might be compared to. Boss fights especially are a mere calculus of rolls, jumps, and the correct attack button during the punish. Shadow of the TheoTTree is the rubber band finally snapping, so to speak. The combat systems have been pushed to their absolute limit, and it's started to really reflect in the played experience. I don't like Shadow of the TheoTTree. It's probably the most unpleasant gaming experience I've ever had. Certainly the most unpleasant I can call to memory right now. I'm certain I've played worse games, but none quite so unenjoyable to me.
The way I see it, FromSoft encountered a problem. How do we keep up our reputation of making hard games if we aren't introducing any new base mechanics that are difficult to master, since it's still just dodge hit?
So that's all you do here. You roll, you poke, you roll, you poke. Now that sounds kind of boring and simple, but the main problem of this is that's exactly how you fight every single non-gimmicky boss fight and every single enemy in the entire genre. That's what a Souls-like is. That's the core combat of the Souls-like games. Now I know many of you have a question and you want to know why. What the hell is wrong with the fandom? The short answer to that is the fandom is filled with extremely low IQ morons who are permanently stuck in their basements, never having achieved anything until they played these games. And like the stupid losers they are, they weren't able to see what these games are about, and their brains got tricked into thinking they have finally accomplished something. They now think they are capable of doing something great, like beating a hard game, when in reality these games are not hard. It has nothing to do with skill, it's pure luck. So most people win by heavily relying on luck, and they will still pretend they are winning because of skill, because they are so desperate to stroke their ego.
This video aims not only to challenge the notion that combat in FromSoftware games is shallow to a fault, but also to provide a thorough examination of video game combat as a whole. First, I will explain in an intuitive manner the essence of a combat system, and the meaning of depth in relation to it, defining terms that are central to the topic of discussion, and that otherwise would be unclear, is essential, or else, any arguments will rest upon ambiguity. Those already inclined toward a particular viewpoint will thus simply reinforce their existing biases, while others may find themselves agreeing with arguments they do not plainly understand. A recurring pattern in poorly written video game criticism, whether born of dishonesty or incompetence, is the careless use of terms such as depth and complexity without ever properly defining them. Such concepts are often thrown around as rhetorical devices rather than analytical tools, leaving the discussion vague and, ultimately, meaningless. After having defined and dissected what constitutes a combat system and the contextual meaning of depth, I'll compare the Souls and Souls-adjacent games to other titles commonly regarded as possessing deeper combat systems, exploring the differences between them and assessing, as fairly as possible, whether those systems are strictly more complex, more nuanced, and, as some would say, better, or generally different in their design priorities and implementations. Throughout this section, I'll refute various fallacious arguments, clear misunderstandings, and address the inflammatory discourse surrounding the topic, And then, I will conclude with a brief analysis of the combat mechanics of each From Software title, and share some criticisms of my own when I feel they are warranted. The intent of this video is not merely to defend what I like, but to elucidate and create meaningful discussion. As a rule, the core of every combat system is punishing openings. In other words, attacking an enemy and protecting your character. If you're not punishing an opening, as in, a momentary state of vulnerability of an enemy, with an input, you're not engaging in combat. Likewise, if there are no openings to be exploited, it means you're facing a target's dummy, not an opponent, and thus, it isn't a combat situation. Breaking a box, for example, is not a combat situation. Combat demands tension, the interplay between risk and opportunity. Remove that tension, and what remains is either a training exercise or a mechanically shallow visual experience. This principle is why having mechanically interesting and varied enemy designs is almost as important as having compelling options for player inputs. Interesting combat emerges not only from what players can do, but from dealing with the multitude of threats, openings, and tactical challenges that enemies and complementary elements present. Having established this premise, there are two major elaborations to make. First, that a combat system becomes deeper the more options the player has for engaging with enemies. These options primarily range from varied forms of attack to varied forms of defense. However, for each option to matter, they must be applicable, else they are useless. If a game offered you 10 different forms of attack, but only one of them dealt damage, the 9 other options functionally do not exist. Similarly, if enemies can ignore a defensive maneuver, the player will simply not use it. Additional mechanics, such as a stamina system, also increase a game's depth, because they prompt the player to make meaningful decisions. If combat depth were to be defined in a single phrase, it would be this: the frequency and variety of meaningful decision-making. And second, the enemy design must consider the wide array of possibilities of player inputs. A combat system may be deep on paper, but it only becomes practically deep in proportion to how well designed the enemies of its respective game are. Core enemy types should ideally be designed around all possibilities of player inputs. Some enemies could demand, or incentivize the usage of specific mechanics to be dealt with, presenting them as a primary solution. There are two poles in combat systems: the active and the reactive. A game can focus on the former, and thus be an active experience, or on the latter, and be a reactive experience. Action, or action-adjacent games, exist on a spectrum between these two opposite concepts. The focus of active games is on providing the player with a feeling of empowerment, and the challenge is mostly centered around fighting in a stylish way. Most have score systems that reward exceptionally skillful play. While protagonists of active games can cancel many of their animations, which often have barely any recovery to begin with, attack and dodge relentlessly, and even stay on the air for prolonged periods of time, those of reactive games usually must deal with burdensome limitations, such as a stamina bar, the inability to heal from a menu or a quick animation, slower, heavier movements, etc. The focus is precisely the opposite. The character feels vulnerable and grounded in the world, not like he's playing with dolls on a sandbox. Actions like spacing and strafing, which tends to be but an asterisk in hack-and-slash games, are engaging, very important, and more difficult to perform. And so are dodges. You can't simply ignore a boss by staying at a corner and chipping his health away with attacks that require no commitment, or stay airborne to avoid most of his attacks. Since healing cannot be performed from the safety of a pause menu, and instead requires committing to a lengthy animation with significant wind-up and recovery, you must first create an opening in which it's safe to heal. This preserves the tension throughout the encounter, as surviving is never guaranteed simply because you possess healing items.
Input buffering is still overzealous and sometimes feels inconsistent, a minor annoyance in the early games but completely unacceptable for something the speed of Bloodborne or Dark Souls 3.
Reactive games often have an input buffering system, meaning every press of a button matters. The player is held accountable for each of them. You can't mash your attacks like in hack-and-slash games, much less your dodges, else you'll be punished. Unlike those who are illiterate in game design seem to think, this is not a flaw, but a fundamental part of their design. Protagonists of active games may have hundreds of different moves, while those of reactive games may be limited to a dozen, 2 dozen or so. Inversely, however, the enemies, and especially the bosses of reactive games, are often much more complex, or harder to deal with than those of active games, featuring moves that demand quick or methodic responses from the player, oppressive combo strings, reactions to player positioning, and to player input. Many hack-and-slash games have as core enemy types entities that become target dummies once the player starts a combo. An interaction that, when executed well, demands from the player deliberate and agile command over the various attack possibilities and combo strings. Even bosses from active-focused games can feel clumsy, predictable, or sluggish, as though they are moving in slow motion in relation to the player character. Their attacks tend to have easily readable wind-ups and lengthy recovery animations, as to not disturb the player's combos, and have long periods of vulnerability, in which they expose themselves to attacks. For the same reason, the responses they demand from players are often very easy to execute. Traditionally, enemies have a single attack, maybe 2, which, on their own, can be avoided simply by walking slowly to the side, and they are often content to stay around the player, attacking seemingly at random. They are about as mechanically threatening as the meagerest hollows from Dark Souls, who have twice as complex movesets as them, with better tracking, and are more aggressive. Bosses, similarly, have very simple movesets, and often no gimmicks that demand tactical approaches. Needless to say, there are exceptions to this rule, as there are for every rule. Reactive games often have not just enemies that are more complex than those of active games. They have dozens, and dozens more of them. Counting bosses, Dark Souls 1 has around 90 different enemy types, Dark Souls 2 has around 142, Bloodborne may have more than 200. In comparison, Devil May Cry 3 has around 24. The first Nioh game was heavily criticized for having repetitive enemy and boss encounters, and rightfully so, yet it has around 70. Decent tracking in proportion to player movements that requires deliberate responses to be dealt with is a mark of reactive enemy design. This doesn't mean attacks with such tracking require, necessarily, a dodge. The player is rewarded by mastering the arts of running, strafing, and positioning, as those actions require less commitments to be executed. They spend less stamina, if at all, and have no recovery, and so, the openings they create are better. In active games, these actions are significantly easier to perform for a series of reasons, such as the lack of a stamina system and other restrictions, and the faster speed and higher agility of player characters, and they yield lesser rewards, as players are incentivized to remain aggressive, and simply staying in the air is enough to avoid many attacks. In fact, spacing is often out of the question, simply due to the sheer number of enemies on screen, which leads me to the next points. In active games, enemies come in large numbers, while in reactive games, they come in smaller groups, and one-on-one encounters, which barely appear in active games, are rather frequent. Adjacently, most levels of active games consist of a series of comparatively large, mostly empty areas connected by corridors and elevators, while those of reactive games feature carefully curated layouts, full of traps and holes, and which are frequently paired with stage hazards or gimmicks. Reactive games have fall damage, active games do not. Enemies of active games spawn in waves, out of thin air, or from portals on the walls and ground. Those of reactive games are methodically placed at their locations. Ambushes are very frequent. Tight spaces like corridors and tunnels may make a simple enemy or boss twice as dangerous, but, on the other hand, smart players can take advantage of area layouts and use pillars and other structures to momentarily hide from a boss or kite enemies around. Lock-on systems are more prominent in reactive games due to their emphasis on encounters against more capable enemies. While active games allow for skill to be expressed in active ways, through different combos, character mechanics or fighting styles, reactive games allow for skill to be expressed through reaction to enemy patterns, mechanics, and gimmicks. And while they don't tend to have multiple characters, and a wide array of combos, and unique moves with fighting game inputs, most of them have RPG mechanics that allow for completely different approaches and tactics, making room for a ludicrous amount of experimentation. For instance, a player can create a shield-poking build that can nullify the moveset of even the hardest bosses, or he may create a fast-rolling, fast-attacking build. He could make a build that relies on trading hits with a heavy weapon. He may choose to stack buffs upon his character and kill a boss with only a few casts of a spell, etc. You can come to a fight with a low-level character, or at high levels, and even plan to use a specific setup against a specific boss in most reactive action RPG games, as it tends to be far from linear, in stark contrast to active games, most of which are purely linear experiences. The harder and the more combat-oriented a boss fight is, the less it is usually prone to such experimentation. The same is true, however, for active games to a degree. That is because the harder an enemy is, the more relevant meta setups and mechanics become. And if his moveset is oppressive enough, weaker builds or mechanics feel like burdensome limitations, and exploiting the more conventional or useful tactics is then encouraged. An unorthodox but intuitive way of comparing the two game philosophies is by contrasting the opening sequence of a game like Devil May Cry 3 with that of Demon's Souls. The former was designed to make the protagonist feel as cool and invincible as possible. The other, to make him feel helpless, as though he must pass impossible odds to succeed. The player is often taunted at the start of a reactive game, as if to entice him to prove he is capable of besting the challenge that lies ahead. Even games like Sekiro and Bloodborne, which feature fast-paced, highly dynamic combat systems for their category, still treat the player like an underdog, both in story and gameplay. In active games, the player is the one who does the taunting, literally in many cases. Taking damage is a stain on a scoreboard, and dying means getting a game over. Continuing means simply rewriting that reality. The protagonist would not have performed as poorly as that in canon. In reactive games, the player is expected to take damage very frequently, and death is diegetically integrated into the story and themes. So much so, that they often start with a set piece that ends in a mandatory death. In active games, most instances of damage are relatively insignificant. In reactive games, a single mistake can lead to your death. Enemy and boss hits often take a quarter, a third, half, or even more of your health points, while in active games, the same is seldom true, and only for hardcore difficulty modes. To clarify, this does not mean that reactive games are necessarily harder than active games, by virtue of their mechanics and so on. The harder difficulties of most hack and slashes can be as tough, if not significantly more difficult to beat, than a regular playthrough of a reactive game like Bloodborne. And unlike Bloodborne, they encourage you to play in the most try-hard of ways to get better grades. The main point, which I will repeat, is that the design priorities for each type of game are different. An example of a game that is close to the middle of the spectrum is Monster Hunter World. The player has access to a highly versatile moveset, and it's possible, especially for skilled players, to remain as the aggressor by chaining attacks. The hunter can mount monsters and slam them onto walls, staggering them for lengthy periods of time, during which they are vulnerable to attacks. But monsters also demand frequent reactions, in proportion to active player inputs, and have access to dangerous and vast movesets. Fights like Iceborne's Fatalis are more reactive than they are active, and playing solo shifts the scales more towards reactive gameplay as well. Spacing is particularly important in Monster Hunter. It is a defining feature of its combat system. The older Monster Hunter games are far more reactive than the newer ones. In Freedom Unite, positioning was king. There were no parries, counters, or similar mechanics. Rolling, running, methodic walking, and blocking were the essence of its combat. The player could not perform anime-style moves to jump into the air. The attack strings were basic, and monsters more scarcely reacted to player input. I'd place Ninja Gaiden near the middle of the spectrum. While enemies are absurdly aggressive in comparison to those of most hack-and-slash games, and deal tremendous damage with each hit, the player is encouraged to be as aggressive as possible, and to combat them by neutralizing them before they get a chance to attack, and by abusing invincibility frames. Bosses, however, usually demand more reactive play. Many of them can defend against, or effectively neutralize active mechanics. The second game is more active than the first one, as offensive options were buffed. The good God of War games are highly active, but still more reactive focused than a series like Devil May Cry, which is at the limit of the active spectrum. Speaking of Devil May Cry, each title drifted further towards impressively technical active gameplay. Fury is a highly reactive game that pairs bullet hell mechanics with a unique combat system that focuses on parrying. The Neo series is akin to a mixture of Ninja Gaiden, a franchise also developed by Team Ninja, and Dark Souls, which it is profoundly inspired by. It is very reactive, but features many active elements. Its combat system is the most complex of all reactive games I have ever played. Onimusha is very simplistic, as it was a pioneer of 3D action games. The main principle behind its combat is spacing, and most bosses dictates the pace of battle. I'd place it around the middle of the spectrum. And, of course, most games developed by From Software since Demon's Souls would fit towards the reactive end of the spectrum. An interesting observation about this dichotomy is that, as a rule, the more skilled and knowledgeable the player becomes in a reactive game, the more they can shift its gameplay towards an active one. Conversely, the higher the difficulty of an enemy, or especially boss encounter of an active game, the more it tends to compel the player to adopt a reactive, or defensive playstyle. Higher difficulty modes of hack-and-slash games often force players to play cautiously in this sense. In summary, active games emphasize proactivity, reactive games emphasize counteraction. One is not better or more remarkable than the other, it's a matter of preference for certain design priorities over others. The analysis I have provided identifies the basis of why there is a loud minority of people who utterly despise the combat of Souls games and call it Rollslop. To be clear, I am neither saying you can simply not enjoy Souls games, nor that there aren't valid criticisms to make against them. I'll make some myself in this video. I am addressing bad faith criticism, and more generally, inflammatory, bitter discourse surrounding them. Those aforementioned people prefer the combat of active games, and are annoyed that so many people find the combat of reactive games fun and enjoyable. Many among them can't comprehend why reactive combat is remarkable, and thus feel a sense of superiority toward people who enjoy it. In most cases, they have either a dislike for reactive games, and have barely played them, or have played one or two Souls games, didn't bother to master their mechanics, and many of them got outright filtered, because they went in thinking they'd be competent enough to breeze through them, and were met with a challenge higher than what they had expected. For example, Dark Souls 2 is one of the simpler Souls games, but it filtered many people, because it demands caution and strategy, more so than a few others. Many of those people feel that Souls games should not be as successful as they are, because they would have preferred it if the gaming industry made more action games that caters to their tastes instead. Some who espouse this rhetoric are simply normies who consume slop, and can't bear seeing games which they could not get into, or were filtered by, growing in popularity. They feel left out, and such people can't stomach not being part of a herd. Even those that go out of their way to play From Software games feel as though they are humiliated by having had to struggle as hard as they did to pass some of their more difficult parts, if they did that at all. Especially in Elden Ring, the first Souls game many of them have played, due to it being the one to have penetrated deep into the mainstream. They desperately want to fit in, but simultaneously feel as though they must voice their pains. They want From Software to cater to them and make their games more accessible to the lower denominators. Even though From Software has been making their games more accessible bit by bit, it wasn't sufficient for many among the more casual audience. These two primary categories of detractors are often intertwined.
Why am I toxic? What?
There's also a spectrum between them. Espousing the stupid notion that the combat of Souls games can be defined as dodge and hit, and referring to it as Rollslop, serves less to describe them in any sensible capacity, and more to tell on the person who's saying it. He is both ignorant of game design, and, most likely, relies on rolling to an excessive degree. Furthermore, this reduction can be responded to by simply doing the same to other genres. Hack-and-slash games are merely button mashers. The gameplay of every FPS game consists of just pointing and shooting. It is wholly delusive to jumble all Souls games together, and then assert they only allow limited skill expression. Elden Ring allows for some of the most impressive displays of skill and creativity of any game. On screen is a run by player and YouTuber Clinky Mocha, using a spellsword build, against a boss considered to be one of the most oppressive, difficult fights of any From Software title. Of course, the game doesn't incentivize playing like this, as would many active games, but nonetheless it allows for it, and is built around experimentation. I had originally written into the script a detailed analysis of the evolution of the combat of From Software's games, going from Demon Souls to Elden Ring Night Rain, but decided to remove it, as it should be self-evident for anyone who's engaging with this topic in good faith, that treating all of them as mechanically interchangeable is an egregious display of idiocy. Demon Souls is nearly as different to Night Rain as Devil May Cry 1 is to Devil May Cry 5. Imagine fighting a boss from Shadow of the Erdtree in Demon Souls, or fighting a boss from Demon Souls in Night Rain. It would feel as strange as fighting Rathalos from Monster Hunter World in Freedom Unite, or vice versa. This genre of misguided, or dishonest criticism of Souls games was made popular by Matthewmatosis through his video titles The Lost Soul Arts of Demon Souls. I've already made a comprehensive response to it, so I won't delve further into the topic here. There are, obviously, proper criticisms to make about From Software titles, some of which are related to their combat mechanics. For instance, some late game and DLC bosses of Elden Ring have movesets and behavior patterns that feel a bit too oppressive, and Malenia outright breaks the game's rules. Some attacks were evidently not as polished as they should have been. The waterfall dance is a great example, as it can't be avoided, unless one either abuses its tracking by running in circles around Malenia in a clunky way that clearly feels unintentional, or by always accounting for it after having closely studied the behavior of her AI, or by using niche items and dashes of war, such as throwing a frost pot at her. Matthew's circular laser pattern is simply undodgeable. Dark Souls 2 shouldn't have allowed the player to carry as many healing items as it did. If it had a limit of 10 or 20 for the basic life gem type, and a limit of 5 or 10 for the other items, the issue would have been resolved. Dark Souls 3 ignored many mechanics from its direct predecessor that would have elevated its combat system and RPG aspects to an incredible degree. A common criticism of it is that the mid-roll is overtuned, as it has an overabundance of iframes and costs little stamina, making it very spammable. Both the ADP mechanic and the weight system of Dark Souls 2 would have fixed this issue, a fact only few are willing to consider and think logically about. Dark Souls 3 has the opportunity to refine the agility mechanic. Even simply being clearer about its functionality would already have been sufficient for many players. None of these criticisms mean the combat of Souls games has, quote, reached its breaking point, end quote. Only that each game has its own faults, and that there is a margin for error within the possibilities of their combat systems, and with their implementations. Those that complain about the aggressiveness, and sometimes game-breaking difficulty of bosses from Elden Ring would have a stroke playing Ninja Gaiden, in which bosses, usually, do not have forgiving wind-up animations for attacks, and can cancel their own recoveries, often arbitrarily. The same is true, to a lesser degree, of many bosses from the Nioh series. Is that a sign of poor design? Not necessarily. In the context of From Software's games, I personally prefer the traditional style of Souls boss fights, which emphasize fairness and allow for experimental approaches, however. And this is the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support my work and get access to a Substack-like blog, in which I post analysis of the Bible and religion, and of literature, films, music clips, manga, anime, other games, and more, you can join my Patreon. By subscribing to it, or by becoming a member of the channel, you also get access to an exclusive Discord server, in which you can talk to me directly